Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel discussion titled Leadership Launchpad, Charting Pathways to Leadership in Cybersecurity. Our moderator is Riz Khan, international journalist and TV host, Al Arabiya English. Our panelists are Her Excellency Dr. Hala bint Mazyad Al-Tuwaijri, President of the Human Rights Commission, Saudi Arabia; Chik, President, Identity and Network Access, Microsoft; Silvana Koch-Mehrin, Founder and President, Women Political Leaders, WPL. Riz, over to you.
Thank you very much. Your Royal Highnesses, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, ahlan wa sahlan, sabah al khair, the best I can do in my Arabic. Welcome and good morning. We have our panel here. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I want to point out this next session, as you heard, Leadership Launchpad, Charting Paths to Cyber Leadership, is actually a very important one, particularly to our host country, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because the society here is going through a dramatic change that has effectively now engaged a largely underutilized sector of its population. Now, you might recall a riddle that many school kids like to try out. It's an old one. From when I was a kid, we used to tell this riddle. And the story is that a man and his son are in a bad car accident. The father is killed, the man is killed, and the boy is taken quickly to hospital. And when they push the boy in to the operating theater, the surgeon, the doctor, looks at the boy and says, "Oh my goodness, that's my son." And then you ask the question, how can that be? Because of course, in those days, everyone assumed that the surgeon, the doctor, must be a man. And of course, the answer is, the surgeon is a woman. So it's one of those things that the assumption was wrong. And that same assumption has been made for anyone working in engineering, IT, cybersecurity, and now even artificial intelligence. And yet so many women are leading contributors to this field, including one day, I hope, my 18-year-old daughter, who's just started at the University of Virginia in technology, engineering, focusing on artificial intelligence. Now, research has shown that there is a major underrepresentation of women when it comes to these particular sciences. One research paper I found said the number of female AI professionals is only 22% of the total. We'll discuss more of that in a moment. So what needs to change? Where does the problem lie? Is it a lack of opportunity for the women to rise? A general lack of interest in these subjects on the part of the women? Personally, I don't think that's the case. Or is it perhaps a more complex equation that includes more inclusive corporate culture, mentorships, better induction, better prospects, and so on? Our experienced panel will aim to answer these questions, and I want to introduce them briefly and move straight to the discussion. You heard we have Her Excellency Dr. Hala bint Mazyad Al-Tuwaijri, who's the President of the Human Rights Commission of Saudi Arabia. Chik is President of Identity and Network Access for Microsoft, and Silvana Koch-Mehrin is the founder and president of Women Political Leaders, WPL. So first, I'm glad to have a panel that has this experience as accomplished women to discuss this important issue. I'm going to start with Her Excellency, Dr. Hala. I'll join you, actually, sit down so the seat doesn't look too empty. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now on a fast track to engage what I just called the underutilized sector of its population. And basically, women can now do much more thanks to the remarkable transformation that's been taking place in this country. But that fast track itself presents a challenge. Because on one hand, women, especially the younger generations, now need time to develop the skill sets in order to rise. And yet the kingdom wants them like yesterday out there in the workforce. So how do you balance that equation? What can you do to make sure that equation is balanced, the women have the skill sets and they get the employment? And what can the world learn from the Saudi experience?
Well, thank you very much first for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak at this very significant event about a very critical issue today. You've mentioned probably one of the issues related to the inclusivity of the workforce and the open opportunities for women, and that is true. But I think the situation in Saudi is kind of different because for a very long period of time, women were highly educated in Saudi, not all of them very young. And also, they were only employed in certain sectors. So with the Vision 2030 and with the opening of different sectors for women, and also for all the reforms, the legal, structural, procedure reforms that happened, these new sectors that opened allowed for that kind of leap in the participation of women. So we're talking about the target of 2030 reached early on in 2022. So that is remarkable, and it is the explanation of why we have so many women today joining the labor force, given the fact that these reforms only happened over the course of 6 or 7 years. But the challenge you're discussing in terms of the coming generation, and as a former teacher, I know that what we think are challenges with the younger generations are coming from us, actually, the older generations, because their ability to adapt to changes, their ability to learn from a very young age. I think we will not have a problem with people learning while working or getting upskilled while they are in business. So in a nutshell, the women today are already established. They've been there in the labor force, but only in restricted sectors. And the coming generation, I'm not afraid for, because I know they can do that.
Actually, it's a very valid point, because as technology is evolving so quickly, they can evolve with it, and they don't carry the baggage of the past.
Yes.
You know, I was once interviewing a guy on stage, a young influencer, and I noticed in the audience, the older generation, so my lot, were filming in landscape. All the younger generation were filming in portrait. So, of course, they adapt. Joy, I want to bring you in. Thank you, Dr. Hala. As a senior executive, obviously at a major tech corporation, you've got something of a bird's eye view on the situation. And there is an established issue of many women not having the level of opportunity that reflects their abilities in certain sectors, such as engineering and science. Now, since this conference focuses on cybersecurity, let's explore that particular landscape. What do you see as the primary reason for female cybersecurity professionals blocking them from achieving their full potential? You know, what are those barriers, and how could they be overcome?
Yeah, I mean, great question. First of all, I think, you talk about the stats, right? Like there's only about 22% of women in cybersecurity. So I think it starts with representation. So without the representation, you also don't have enough the role models. So for women, if you can see, who are the leaders who look like you, who, work like you, I think, you can see it. It's harder to be in it or stay in it. So I think both representation as well as having more role models, have senior women, executives in this sector is really important. And then becomes, how do you create a culture? I think you kind of also mentioned it. Just be in it, but if you don't have the culture that actually supports women to do their best work, we are, I think, being Microsoft, for over 26 years, I think early on in both technology and Microsoft, I think we had the cultures more like, you try to blend in and trying to just blend into the existing culture, and mostly very male-dominated. Versus over the past decade, we really have evolved to say, hey, for the culture, you need to be more inclusive. And for me, for example, really talking to everybody is how can we be our authentic selves, especially for women, if we can be who we are and be in a culture, being listened, being heard, and being embraced. I think that's when we can do the best job. And that also, I think, especially in cybersecurity, I often talk about it's more than just a, technical job of computer science or engineers. You actually need a data scientist, for AI especially, you need a mathematician, you need an English major, or even frankly, art major, just having that very different perspective from the cybersecurity landscape, because you really need that holistic view, if you will. So having that culture that embraces, and break down the barrier of the stereotype, like woman is not technical enough, or woman woman is not technical enough, even the cybersecurity space. I think that's really important. And the last thing I would say is also just the opportunity as well as the career development. Because if if you're in the technology and the cybersecurity space, we all know we don't have enough in terms of skills in terms of cybersecurity space. So how can we bring in more women, but also creating opportunity, pave the path, if you will, so that they're taking a more visible assignment, but also have the support system to enable them to be successful, having created that network community. That is really important. So it's not just the representation, but also creating the culture and creating the opportunity. I think it's going to take time, but I think if we don't do it now, and I'm really glad we have a forum like this, really talk about the importance topic, because if we don't have this conversation, then it's hard for us to act. And for us to act it, you have to stay. I often say you have to stay in it to actually make the difference.
Well, I'm glad actually to have a panel of all women, because it's quite rare, I have to say, at these conferences I go to. Interesting what you said about role models too. Hard to believe, but I was the first person of South Asian background in mainstream broadcasting in the West, in the BBC and CNN and so on. And people would come up to me afterwards and said, I went to my parents and said, look, one of us is there. So I want to get onto that subject and mentorship in a minute, but Silvana, I want to welcome you in as well and ask, what is the need for an organization like yours, Women Political Leaders, WPL, and how does its role fit into supporting women in the cybersecurity and tech sector?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this question, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this esteemed forum and on this wonderful panel. And to answer your question, I also like to make 2 points. Those networks are critical because if you're in a minority, peer-to-peer learning is absolutely crucial. And also sometimes I call it a fuel station for motivation, for energy, to kind of get back what it needs to be out there, because when you're in a minority, and specific jobs like politics, like cybersecurity, women still are a minority, despite women being the majority in population worldwide. In those areas, it's a minority issue. And the 2 points that I like to make are, on the one, perception, and the other one, learning. So the learning part, this peer-to-peer learning, what works? So what's beyond the textbooks? What are the rules that my mother never taught me, or my dad couldn't tell me because he's just not a young woman, he's never been one? So what are the things that I need to learn and understand to move on? And this is why mentoring is critical, but I would also say reverse mentoring is very important. And some corporations do that already, that it's not only the traditionally male executive mentoring mid-level women on how to get up to the executive level, but also the inverse, that the mentors are the mid-level women mentoring the male executive to raise the awareness of what is it actually like, the unconscious bias that exists, very often the unintended comments and behaviors of colleagues, of bosses. And the GCF's publication brought up the staggering figure that 87% of the women in cybersecurity jobs feel that this is something that holds them back. And the second one is the perception. And you already said, what I can see that I can be, and your own story was very, very important in that. But the perceptions on capability for leadership, but also perceptions on which jobs are for men, which jobs are for women, that is sticky. That's like really ingrained and deep-rooted in many societies. So it's so impressive to see what's going on here in Saudi Arabia, to question this and say, is this really what we want as a society? Is that what we want for our economic development, our societal development? Is that the ambition that we want to pursue? Or do we want to go forward and change the parameters? That's so important, and that will also be a major driver for change.
It's interesting you raise that, because this issue of culture and how certain changes are perceived leads me on to a question for you, Dr. Hala, because you have a very important role here, very important task, because you represent the kingdom in this way. And I wonder, in the role that you have, let's explore the link between the principles of human rights and the area that you oversee in the kingdom, and how the issue of cybersecurity leadership, inclusivity, and opportunity ties in, especially for women, when it comes to cultural perceptions.
Yeah. So cyberspace is becoming an open space, like any space, and therefore we exist also on that cyberspace, and therefore that existence and the security of our interactions is very critical, and it's governed by the same principles and standards of human rights that we have for our normal kind of living, if we may call that, and not offend anybody here. So going back to when we talk about inclusivity, when we talk about equal access, equal opportunities, these are the standards of human rights when it comes to the lives and well-being and opportunities for women. So the same thing applies to the cyberspace, and therefore the initiative that was launched by His Royal Highness tackled specifically this issue, that how can we guarantee that there is a space in which we exist and it does not have the same standards and principles that we have in the normal space. And therefore, yes, as much as we need to empower women in the real world, we also need to empower women in the cyberspace, specifically also in the security of the cyberspace. And the initiative about the protection of children, it's again following the same principle. We cannot have a space like that and not govern the interactions by the standards of human rights. So when we look at it, it's not a matter of luxury or that we want just to hold a flag that we're empowering women. It's a necessity. It's an economic and a security necessity for us to have women play a role, because from our experience in Saudi, the empowerment of women could not have reached these levels without the participation of women. Women sitting on the decision-making table, women speaking for the issues of women, started off with the Shura Council and then was carried down to the present, where you cannot address this issue without listening to the first-hand experience of women. And that's why I think it's very critical, it's important, it's a necessity. And if we want to move forward, then we need events like these where we learn from each other, mentorship, training, opportunities for international, multilateral dialogues. All of these platforms will definitely lead to a safer space, cyberspace for women, children, families, and all individuals.
Thank you, Dr. Hala. Now, Joy, in researching for this panel, I was fascinated by a paper I came across from May of this year. And the paper was entitled, "Where Are the Women? A Detailed History of Women in Computer Sciences and How It Impacts Modern Day Industry." It was by Mary Kate Nowak. Now, she's the one who quoted the 22% of women employed in computer technology statistic that I used. And she makes some very interesting observations, saying that there was never always that kind of gender inequality in this field, that women were among the first programmers in the 20th century. They were like the large portion of computer programmers, contributing substantially. And by the early 1940s, they were the majority, but by the late 70s, early 80s, they're always diminished as the cultural stigma set in, saying women shouldn't necessarily be in this sector. And I wonder now, looking at it from your position with Microsoft, how you see that dynamic changing in this kind of newer era of understanding.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I wasn't born in the US, and I was born in China. And then when I grew up in China, I went to computer science major, and it was very 50-50. Right. So, and frankly, the whole, about, the whole unconscious biases, the, gender inequality, that concept didn't exist until I went to the US. And what I see is it's really that the culture piece, which is, one is there's a lot of stigma, if you will. You have to say, hey, is woman technical enough? And and then when you have a majority of the jobs, it becomes, you have all these biases built in during the interview process. Because you kind of, when you interview, you end up hire like-minded, or you hire people who, think like you, work like you. So when I first started Microsoft, very much I think the culture, I mentioned earlier, it's, we have a culture, so you're really trying to blend in. And I very much felt like I need to not just think like a man, I need to dress like a man. I don't want to stand out, even though most of the time I was the only female in a room of men. And I think that has evolved. I think that has caused a barrier both in terms of, do we women feel belong? Do we being considered technical? And do we have an environment we feel we have a seat at the table, seat at the table in the room? And can we actually, advance our career as a result? And that comes to kind of mentoring. For me, I have many mentors across the industry and Microsoft. I remember one of the quotes that really stayed with me for a long time is this gentleman, he actually said, "Hey, Joy, if you feel uncomfortable being in a room full of men just because you're a woman, you kind of stood out and you felt like you need to blend in, you just have to remember, if that is the only advantage if you stood out, the man has many, many different advantages, like the networking and the community and the support, if you will. So take advantage of it and be comfortable being who you are." And that really stayed with me. And I think things like that kind of allyship, men as allies, and I think I would call, given most of this room full the gentlemen here, is be an ally to women, be in that support system. I love the idea about reverse mentoring, because I think especially for male leaders, need to hear the lived-in experience for female, teammates or people working employees working in a company, because by listening and learning those experiences, I think that creates the empathy and also be able to create an environment to support women so that there will be more women in cybersecurity, in technology, and in the industry.
It's actually a very important point, being allies and collaborators rather than competitors and perhaps detractors. That paper that I quoted has an interesting element to it too, talking about AI. And that is that AI essentially is programming and will reflect the biases of that programming. So if women are not involved, then the AI is geared towards a male bias. One example was where they showed how in America the police were using AI to try and profile motorists. And they profiled more black people because the data and information that was put into the AI was geared towards historical stopping of black people because of prejudices, for example. That's quite an important point. Silvana, what do you see as the best strategy for promoting women in the cybersecurity space to advance to executive positions where they can be more decision makers? And then how can that be scaled up globally so that it has a real impact on the industry?
So I guess it's clearly, on the one hand, a numbers game. You need to have a lot of women who could be the potentials to get to the executive level, which then brings us back to how do we get women into that space first and foremost so that they become the potentials to get up to the executive level. And in the first panel, I thought it was very interesting, the eminent leaders, all versed in the topic of security, they were saying they still have a hard time defining what is cybersecurity. And I think if we look at that, that's another stereotype to potentially remove, that cybersecurity does not mean military. Cybersecurity has a lot of different facets and a lot of passion and interest and relevance for women as mothers, as their own experience, what they live in the digital world, which would mean, this is something I would like to work in. So redefining what is cybersecurity to make it less militaristic and maybe less traditionally linked to male spaces, which again, we very much question, right? This is the one hand. The other one, the mentoring piece, and I think reverse one is very critical. And also, it's important to not have just single executives which are almost like paraded around, or see, we have a woman, we've done our job, we're good, it needs to be the normal. It needs to be total normality, not worth mentioning anymore that there are women on the executive level. And this also then means that the influence of those women increases because they're not the token women, which very often still happens, both in politics as well as in those other areas. And then, like yourself, I'd like to also appeal to the audience here. There surely are many fathers of girls who would like to see their daughters thrive. And if it's not for this generation and for the next one, to just end those stereotypes which says, you're a girl, you can do that, you're a boy, you can do that. It's a barrier to all of us, to both boys and girls, and to end with kind of systemizing that the UNDP has done extensive work on the social norms and the perceptions of people in more than 90 countries, and exactly those social norms being barriers for economic development, for cultural development. And I think looking at this data, it gives us a lot of to-dos. And very final point, women don't only have to be in STEM jobs. In politics, for example, the Online Safety Act in the UK was very much women politicians driving that. In the EU, the Violence Against Women Directive, which includes online violence for the first time, was basically only women being the drivers. Of course, they had the male allies to then get the majority to pass it, but it just shows there's also other areas from where you can make a real big impact.
So I'm sure you're watching very carefully what will happen in the US.
Of course.
Now coming in November. And of course, it's a very important time for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia because engaging that sector of the workforce kind of doubles the power the Kingdom has. We are, of course, out of time, I'm afraid. There's always so many more questions, never enough time. But I leave you with a thought that always made me laugh when I think about it. The former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, used to tell this story when he was at conferences. He said that, at the World Economic Forum, a CEO was asked to speak, and his wife went along with him. And he was feeling so proud that he'd been asked to be on stage to speak at the World Economic Forum. So as they called him onto stage, he leaned over to her at the table before getting up and said, "My dear, did you ever imagine in your wildest dreams that I would be speaking at the World Economic Forum?" She said, "My dear, you were never in my wildest dreams." So be careful what you say. Please, a big round of applause for our panel. Thank you for an excellent conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.